Thank you very much, Mark, for doing the live streaming, apparently. Live streaming, is that right? Brilliant. Wow. So, well, welcome everybody. Welcome to Suffolk Coastal District Constituency Labour Party. I've just been talking about Mike. Mike is our only Labour District Councillor, which is fantastic. And so thank you very much for coming this evening.
It's a pleasure.
Mike, it's great to have you with us. But there's a by-election coming up in Leicester, so we might get our act together. We might have two Labour District Councillors. Right, I'm going to introduce Anne Pettifor. Right, the Independent newspaper described her as the genius behind the Jubilee 2000 campaign, which she co-founded, and it's led to the cancellation of approximately $100 billion of debt owed by 35 countries. So that was, if you remember, Jubilee 2000. In September 2015, it was announced she'd been appointed to the Labour Party's Economic Advisory Committee, which of course is convened by John McDonnell and reports to Jeremy Corbyn. She stated that she was honoured to be asked to serve with such distinguished colleagues, and she hoped to play her part in overturning the Chancellor's deficit fetishism and his employment of it as a smokescreen for an attack on the state. Over to you, Anne.
Thank you very much. Well, I must say I'm mightily impressed that you're all here on an Easter weekend and a miserable night as it is too. So thank you ever so much for coming. Of course it's an honour to be at Suffolk Coastal Labour Party meetings. I live in Saxmundham and I'm deeply fond of this place and always glad to be here. So I want to start with quoting Mark Twain, who once said, called on us all to go out and buy land, he said. Go out and buy land. Why? Well, because they're not making it anymore. And that is a really fundamental point that actually economics overlooks and doesn't fully understand. When I talk about economics, I mean mainstream economics kind of ignores the nature of land. In just the same way, as anyone who knows about my work will know, the economics profession has a blind spot, believe it or not, for money and in particular for credit. And it really matters when it comes to housing. So what the economics profession would have us believe is that housing and houses and homes and residences and so on are just like a commodity, or just like commodities, and they, like commodities, are subject to the forces of supply and demand. Which is why right now the government is saying build more houses here in Suffolk and in Little Saxmundham. We're under terrific pressure from both the county council but also developers to build more houses. Now, there may well be a shortage of housing in this part of the world, but overall there is no shortage of housing in Britain. No shortage whatsoever. And that doesn't just apply to certain parts of Britain. There's only one region of Britain where it may be argued that there are fewer houses than there are households wanting to live in a house. But mainly, we have a surplus of housing. So the government argues that it's entirely a matter of supply and demand, and that it really has to help its friends in the construction industry to build more houses. It has to change the law, make agricultural land available for house building. It has to use the Bank of England to subsidise mortgages and subsidise housing. And all of these rationales are put out by the government, when in fact, actually, it's not a matter of supply and demand at all. Now, I'm not really an expert on housing. Finance is my territory. But there's a wonderful chap called Ian Mulhern, who, if you haven't come across him, I do recommend you go and find him. He's at the Oxford Research Group, and he is an expert on the availability of housing. And he's done all the research that I draw on. So what I want to do is to sort of step back from the real current question of the crisis in housing, and there's several ways we have to address it, to look a little bit at it in a sort of wider perspective. And that is to understand that land, as Mark Twain impressed on us, is a scarce and finite resource. There's only that much of it. We can't make any more of it. It is there, it is fixed, it's immobile, you can't move it around. The Saudis would like to move a lot of fertile land into their country. They can't, so they're buying up African land. You know. The Japanese are worried about climate change, and they too are out looking, and the Chinese, of course, are out looking for land. They can't move land, so they have to go out and buy additional land. So the characteristic of land is that it's finite. Not so money, not so finance, and not so credit. So this is the theme of my book, which is that while there can be a shortage of all sorts of assets, and there are, and while there are finite limits to the ecosystem, for example, to what we can do, there is never, ever a shortage of money in a well-developed monetary system. And that's the magic of a well-developed monetary system, and it's the wonder of it. I've worked in Malawi, where they don't have a well-developed monetary system. They don't have an independent central bank that they trust. Their currency has little value. Why? Because they don't have the taxpayers that back up the currency. The value of all of our currencies depends on the fact of whether we've got a taxation and a tax collection system and a tax administrative system that holds the value that the Bank of England sets for the currency. So we've got 32 million taxpayers, and we're pretty good at collecting taxes. Of course, there are people who dodge taxes and so on, but on the whole, we're pretty sound at it. The Americans are even better. They've got 62 million taxpayers, so their currency is worth more. But Malawi doesn't really collect taxes, doesn't have the administrative, if you like, system to collect taxes, and its people are very, very poor. And as a result, it also doesn't have the other institutions that are really important to make credit work. So you need to have an accounting system for managing assets and liability. You need to have a sound taxation system, you need to have a sound monetary system. All of these things need to be in place in order for there to be money. And if those institutions are in place and are upheld, there need never, ever be a shortage of money. And that's really important for us to understand, because we're always being told by, for example, the government, there is no money. There's no money for childcare, there's no money for looking after the elderly, there's no money for this, that and the other. There's always money for going to war, and there's always money for bailing out banks. But for these other things, there's never enough money, and that is not true. So credit is a wonderful thing, and you and I are the creators of credit. We create the money supply. There is no money in the bank when we go to the bank to apply for a mortgage, to buy a house, or to buy a flat, or whatever. If we want to borrow £300,000, there is no money in the vault of the bank. You don't need savings for investment. Savings are not needed for investment in, for example, a property. What you do need when you go to the bank is some collateral. You need to have a fairly sound credit record. You need to be able to sign a contract honouring the repayment of the loan, and you have to agree to repay at a rate of interest. And when you do that, the bank simply enters numbers into a computer and transfers it to your account, £300,000 out of thin air. And that is a marvellous institution. We've had an institution like this. We've had these institutions since 1694 when the Bank of England was set up, and it actually explains the Industrial Revolution and the fact that Britain advanced in the way that it did. So, thanks to this sound monetary system, there is never ever a shortage of money in a developed economy. Furthermore, we do not need savings in order to invest. And we never have needed savings to. So when the government says to you, oh, we have to cut spending in order to build up some savings here, in order to be able to spend over there, they're lying. The government doesn't fund its spending from savings. And it doesn't, by the way, fund its spending from taxation, tax revenues either. So all it does is it goes to the Bank of England, or it borrows from capital markets. It says, I promise to pay back in 10 years, 2 years, or 30 years, and on the basis of that, it raises the credit that it needs for expenditure. And that's what you do when you go to the bank and you want a loan, whether you're a small business, whether you want to buy a property, whether you want to invest in some form of speculative activity. So here we have something which is called land, which is finite, immobile, immovable, can't make any more of it, and something over here called credit or money, which is infinite. And this is the theme of my talk fundamentally, that the price of housing, which has risen by some extraordinary amount, I wrote it down just so I could remind you all of it, because I know that you've all experienced this, but it's risen massively. In Bishop's Avenue in North London, an avenue full of posh houses, you could buy the house in Bishop's Avenue in 1988 for £1 million. By 2017, the same house was selling for £65 million. So while between the 1970s and 90s, house prices were fairly unchanged, but since then, since the 90s, they've risen by 160% in real terms. So the question that we really have to face is, if it's not a matter of supply and demand, what is driving the rise in house prices? And that's the thing that I want to address today, because we're not going to be able to deal with the question of housing. And I am talking here mainly about private housing, housing that's financed by mortgages. We're not going to be able to deal with that until we understand the problem. And the problem is not a complicated one. It's too much money chasing too finite amount of land and property. So in London, there's a finite supply of housing. You can add flats and you can build blocks, as they are doing in Wandsworth at the moment. They're building massive blocks on the Thames, which are one-bedroom flats, which they're going to sell at least £1 million, but right now they can't sell them. You can do that, but actually there's very little land in which to expand property. And so if too much credit is aimed at this land, it inflates prices as night follows day. So what we found is that there's been too much money chasing property, too much money. And that's come in the form of, well, the Bank of Mum and Dad has helped. Then there's been all the kind of assistance and subsidies that have come via the Bank of England and the government, the Treasury, help to buy that kind of subsidy. There's lots of other kinds of subsidies. There have been very low interest rates, thanks to the actions of the Bank of England, which, by the way, is still a nationalised bank and is still just effectively a government department. So low interest rates and money. And then there's been global money. There's been money come, Russian oligarchs, Saudi princes, Nigerian crooks. They've all been throwing their money at assets which they understand are valuable and that they believe will rise in price forever. They believe their money in there is safe and looked after because we have a sound judicial system, a sound criminal justice system. The taxpayers here pay a lot of money to maintain a sound criminal justice system which takes care of their land and their assets and protects their land and the assets in ways that they aren't protected in, for example, Nigeria or other parts of the world. So we have this flood of money aimed at a finite supply of land and property, and naturally that inflates the prices. So we need to start dismantling this idea that it's down to a supply and demand issue. We're finding that actually the supply of housing is kept up with demand, and demand means household formation. The number of households being formed is lower than the number of houses available for those households. Now, it's not always the case that the housing is in the place where people want it to be. So there are, but even so, even within those constraints, we know there's imbalances. We know that the housing that we want is not in the place that we may want it to be. Nevertheless, across all the regions in Britain, as I've already said, there is a surplus of housing over demand from households wanting somewhere to live. And the reason for this is that since the 1990s, when the prices began to rise, we have financialized housing. We have financialized it in the sense that we no longer treat it as residential accommodation. This is not a dwelling place for us. This is increasingly a financial asset. So a buy-to-let, for example, is a very obvious financial asset. But for the rest of us, we regard our property, the house that we live in, as a financial asset. We expect its value to rise all the time. And it's actually a very fascinating one, because when you go and buy cigarettes, or you go and buy, I don't know, any old thing, a machine of some kind or other, and the price rises, and you need that. You need those cigarettes, or you need that alcohol, or you need that food, and the price is rising, you lose out, right? Your income has stayed the same and prices are rising. You experience a loss each time the price rises of a commodity or something, that a consumer good that you want to buy. But when your house price rises, you experience an increase in wealth. It's the reverse of the way you feel when prices generally rise. You're impoverished by other kinds of prices rising, but when your house price rises, you feel wealthier. So house prices and so on are very different from the pricing of most commodities and most consumer goods. So the fact of the matter is that we're now in a position where we've turned what was our dwelling place and what we regarded primarily as a dwelling place into a financial asset. We sometimes do it very consciously, Airbnb, buy-to-let, that kind of thing, but we also do it unconsciously. We expect that our house should rise in price and increase in value. We no longer think of it just as a dwelling place. We think of it as our pension. We think of it as something we'll sell in the future to be a pension, right? And that's because our pensions have fallen, and because we no longer have steady, stable, or reliable pensions on the whole. And so we do need to find some sort of income for the future, for when we get older. And so we regard our house as being that kind of financial asset. And the problem with turning property, dwelling places, land into financial assets is that all you need is a flood of money into this asset for it to be inflated and to become unaffordable and beyond the reach of, for example, young people. And our crisis is that really it's the young that cannot afford to find a dwelling place because of the financialized asset which is now beyond their reach. So for me, this is the really major issue that we have to face, in which the government doesn't face. The government insists on the demand and supply perspective, and it won't look at what the real problem is, because its friends in the financial sector and in the construction industry quite like things as they are, as they're going on at the moment. They quite like the government to subsidise new house building and so on. And the final thing I want to say is this. We believe that we have a domestic market for housing and for property. And that's a delusion. There is no such thing as a British housing market. There is only one market for housing, for property, and it's a global market. In the old days, there used to be a British housing market. There used to be a national housing market. It used to be different from housing markets in other parts of the world. No longer. There is now one global market in property. And people with mobile mobile financial resources are going around buying property all over the world. I go to New Zealand next week because they have a huge housing crisis. Auckland house prices are way through the roof. And New Zealand is this tiny country of 4 million people. And house prices just keep rising, and their young people can't find anywhere to live, and they have social and political problems as a result. And they don't quite know what to do about it. But New Zealand is just another one of the markets that belong, one part of this global market in property. So a Silicon Valley billionaire will buy himself a fancy house in some part of New Zealand. Or he'll buy himself a flat in Paris and one in London and an apartment in New York. And people with that kind of money who operate at that level regard these markets as being one kind of market. The final thing I want to stress is this, that believe it or not, there's not enough debt in the world. Now, first of all, there's an awful lot of debt, and I have problems with that, and I'll explain that in a moment. But one of the reasons we have, first of all, we have a globalized mobile financial system, a global system of financial mobility. But actually, all of this, if I can go back to the beginning of the story, of the creation of credit, for money to be created, for there to be the amount of money there is floating around in the world, requires collateral, requires an asset to back it up, right? So when you go to the bank and you want £300,000, you've got to have some collateral of some kind or another to just back up the fact that if you were to default on your loan, the bank could take that property and somehow compensate itself for the loss, right? But there's a shortage of collateral in the world. There's a shortage of assets in the world. And one of the safest assets in the world is debt, sovereign debt, government debt. And we've lived through a period of austerity when governments have cut their debt massively and refused to borrow. And as a result, there's a shortage of this asset known as sovereign debt, which is where normally people would invest. Pension funds, for example. Pension funds are desperate to invest in sovereign government debt. Why? Well, because the British government's going to be here in 30 years' time when it has to pay out the pensions, right? Because the American government's going to be here in 60 years' time when they're going to have to pay out pensions, right? And because the American government's never defaulted on its debt, nor has the British government ever defaulted on its debt. Its asset is a good, sound asset. But across the world, post-crisis, we began to shrink the creation of these assets, these sovereign debt assets. So what do people do? They look to property to act as an asset. So a lot of rich people are buying property as collateral to leverage additional borrowing. And it works like this. If you have a buy-to-let, you use the income from that buy-to-let, the fact that you've got an asset with rent coming in every month, to go to the bank and say, look, I have an asset with rent coming in every month, give me another 30,000 quid and I might be able to buy another property, right? So people with assets, especially income-generating assets, use their asset to leverage additional money. But when there's a shortage of assets, there's a crisis. And so property has been one of those assets that money has flown into, has been channeled into, when other assets were in short supply. Now this is a big problem. The financial crisis of 2007 was precipitated by the fact that property, which was being used as collateral, subprime property, was A, not very good collateral, and B, was very difficult to value. And this is going to happen again. This will be the cause of the next financial crisis, when people think, oh my God, I bought that buy-to-let in Hackney and I thought it was going to be worth £200,000 and I can't sell it at the moment for £200,000. I'm going to have to lower the price. And then I lower it. And right now what's happening in London is that prices on properties are falling. Developers are finding they can't sell these big properties. And that's when panics begin and when crises are precipitated. So I've gone across a massive waterfront here, if you like, starting with land and with credit and with assets. But I think it's really important for us to understand those key concepts driving house price rises. Now, what has that got to do here, locally? Well, combined with the fact that we don't have sufficient housing and we don't have affordable housing here. We have people coming into the region with a lot of money and inflating the value of houses. And we have governments having withdrawn from building social affordable housing for local people. Right? So that is the major cause. Now, I don't believe that we need more private housing. I don't believe there's a shortage of private housing, but there is definitely a shortage of affordable housing. And there's a shortage of safe assets in the world. Pension funds don't have enough sovereign debt to invest in. It's a really big problem. It's a really big problem. It is why the price of these assets is high and the yield, the interest rate, is low. It's why the Bank of England has been able to maintain such very low rates of interest over time. So the really important point is going to be for government to begin to create more safe assets for the financial system. In other words, for the government to borrow and create debt, and to use that debt to build social housing. And really, I just want to impress this upon you. The creation of safe assets is fundamental to the global financial system. Those big private equity firms, those big investment banks cannot be creating or allowing for new credit to be created without safe collateral, without safe assets. And there are insufficient safe assets for the maintenance of the global financial system. So I'm going to end on that note, which is that for us to have housing for people in Suffolk who cannot afford currency to get a house requires us to do something that would help all those billionaires out there as well that work in the banking and the shadow banking sectors. So there is a terrific logic and reasoning behind why we need more social housing, but also why we don't need more private housing. So I think I feel I've covered too much ground here, but I hope that I've just given you some things to think about and that we could have a Q&A session where I could explain this a little more clearly than I have already. Thank you very much.
Anne is always so clear in her explanations, isn't she? Right, questions? I thought you were going to write something on affordable housing, Mike.
Yep.
Right,
It's coming.
Coming, yeah.
It's about holiday homes, really, which affects us around here, particularly my village, where each time the house comes on the market, it can't be bought by local persons.
Sorry, what's your name?
Martin Clark from Racing Branch.
Yeah.
You know, it's happening more and more, and that's preventing young people from buying property because it's inflating the value of the house.
Yeah.
Because it can always be marketed in London or in if you like.
Yeah.
It strikes me, it's annoying because it's a second home for someone.
Yeah.
Someone's bought a second home, whereas someone locally hasn't even got a home.
Right.
And I wonder why there isn't a penalty to pay if it's a second home. Why isn't there a much bigger stamp duty, for instance, or which there is in other countries? I know that for a fact. There's huge stamp duty on second homes. Is this all part of the plan to boost the property market, basically?
Sure. Shall we take
Should we take 2 or 3 questions? Right. Mike.
Yes,
Mike.
it is regarding affordable homes, which in reality are far from affordable for local people. Now, where I live in Felixstowe...
You mean on the developers in there?
Yeah. Sorry, yes. Where I live, there's a new estate being built of some nearly 200 homes, a third of which are allegedly affordable.
Right.
In reality, the cheapest home is £240,000, which no young couple, I would suggest, in this area could afford. And I really would be interested to know what you can do to address that sort of problem.
Okay. Anything else?
Somebody called you up there.
Yeah, my name's Matt Salisbury.
Sorry, what's your name?
My name's Matt Salisbury.
Matt,
We've been talking about buying houses. What about renting? I mean, there are more and more people in more and more precarious work. Wages are falling. Millions of people can't get a mortgage. And, if we want a workforce that can move around and follow jobs and be flexible, I mean, are we just proposing that we're creating affordable houses to buy? People only buy houses because they have no choice, because they can't afford the rent, so they're, an awful lot of people are forced into an enormous debt to buy a house because the alternative is even worse.
Yeah.
I mean, what can we do about that?
Right. So, Martin, the holiday homes, So we don't tax we don't tax efficiently people that own second homes. We don't impose a tax on speculation in property either. We don't tax. I mean, part of the way in which we subsidise the private house building sector is by not actually imposing sensible taxes on it. Now, the Germans have got something called a property speculation tax, and in my Guardian article I advocated that we should be thinking about that, so that people who buy second homes have to pay a tax on that, to discourage that kind of thing, or to at least help them to contribute towards the government's coffers. So yes, definitely we have to, I mean, I'm not an expert on housing, but definitely we have to do much more in the way of taxing people acquiring these assets and making capital gains from those assets. So there's not enough of that. I'm not sure that we can actually impose a law saying you can't have a second home. I think that would be difficult. But areas of natural beauty and touristy areas are always going to have, I think, a problem with that. But it's exacerbated by the fact that actually it's just profitable to have more than one property, basically, and it doesn't cost very much because of the low levels of taxation. And Mike, the cost of so-called affordable housing. I mean, I think we see this in Saxmundham, that developers, are really very careless about allocating homes, and when they do, they're very, very expensive. They're effectively, privately marketised. And when they do provide what they call social housing, I must say I think it's pretty damn bad. But I blame local authorities for that. Local authorities could be much stricter in planning terms, and I think there's a lot of collusion between developers and local authorities around that sort of thing. So we could, what the thing that bugs me is that we don't understand the powers that we have, really. And I say that not just about local authorities, but about as citizens. This is land that is very valuable. We've given away, Saxmundham Town Council has given away an awful lot of land, admittedly in the past, which is now incredibly valuable, and we've made no gain on that for the purposes of community. But also we allow the developers, we give developers access to land without enough conditionality on that. And I think that we as citizens have to understand that we have much greater leverage than we think we have, and we should start demanding it. The politicians are not going to do anything about this until we start saying that something must be done. And it's terribly difficult because there are people who think they can afford a new house being built on a new development and therefore don't want to object to new housing, while at the same time there are people that fully understand that the developers are only building those estates in order to make enormous profits. So, that's why I think local authorities have to regain powers to build housing, and the land and the government has to be able to have powers. The state has to have powers to be able to obtain land at an affordable rate for that public housing. We've just got to go back to thinking like that, and we don't think like that enough, and certainly not in Suffolk.
So, social housing rather than affordable housing.
I think social housing.
By the local authorities again.
Yes.
That should go down very well.
Very much so. Absolutely. It is certainly about time. And what the government has done is put caps on the ability of local authorities to raise the finance to build, and that is evil, really, because local authorities charge rent as well on their properties, and therefore, the investment in that property will pay for itself over time. And the fact that the government prohibits local authorities from doing that is a concession to the private developers. And unless we understand that this is not some sort of innocent game that the government's playing, it's a collusion between government, our elected politicians and these developers, and we allow it to happen. How many people make a fuss about that? Nobody makes a fuss about it. So one of the things I was hoping the Labour Party would begin to argue was to lift the cap on the ability of local authorities to borrow. Because the best thing they could do is to borrow to build housing, which generates income, which helps to repay the borrowing in the first place. Max, renting, why don't people rent? Well, absolutely, in Germany, people don't think that they have to own a property. We're a property-owning democracy here, and we have this thing about having our own bit of land and so on. Again, I'm in favour of rent controls, and most economists are deeply opposed to rent controls, think, oh, that'll distort the market and all of that. One of the reasons people don't rent is that there aren't rent controls. People are terrified of moving into a property at a certain rent, knowing full well the landlord has then got terrific leverage over them and can just up the rent, unilaterally without any controls by authorities. And precisely because land is finite, I think is a reason for us to be regulating the way the owners of land can generate rent. I've got a lovely quote here from Adam Smith, who's hardly a radical, who said, as soon as the land of any country has all become private property, the landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they never sowed and demand a rent even for its natural produce. So, we live in this culture where we think that people are entitled to this thing which is finite and limited, and once they have it, can charge whatever rent they like. And I think we have to say no, that there's a limited amount, there's a finite amount of land in Britain, and it's owned by all of us. We all need somewhere to live, and that therefore there should be some controls on the capital gains that can be made via rent from land. And if we impose those controls, as the Germans do, I think you'd find that renting would become fashionable again. Okay?
You've got your hand up really quickly, and then Martin, and then Pete.
Yeah, I'm no economist,
And your name is?
David.
David.
Yeah. Didn't quantum easing create capital without collateral? Didn't it create debt without collateral? Which didn't that go against, you were saying you had to have collateral, but I didn't understand quantum easing, but I assumed it was the government creating money to finance things without any debt.
Okay, fine, I'll deal with that. And then Martin?
Thank you. I listened very carefully and with great interest, and I've read your Guardian article a couple of times.
Yeah.
I think a slightly broader comment, if I may. Your banner, as in the Guardian, was housing crisis.
Yeah.
I think it's yielding the past by beginning with considering it as a crisis of ownership.
Right.
And I would, you might have ended up saying the same things, but I think it would be more in tune with what I understand to be Labour Party thinking. The housing crisis surely starts with people who have not got a roof over their heads, who cannot afford to pay rent, and who do not have security of tenure. Therefore, one goes on to how can that be provided, and that in turn goes on to the problems, consequent problems of loss of value for private owners, with the damage therefore to collateral and bank credit and so on and so on. And I would support that by saying I think that shows a proper sense of priorities. And I think also, may I just say one more thing, which is that now and in your Guardian article you do not address the consequences, if it ever were possible, of driving down property prices, truly driving them down, because unless one can, then most people will never now have the income to allow them to buy. Thatcher let the genie out of the bottle. You cannot, I think, stuff it back in. So you've got to accept most people will not be able to buy. And that way round, it surely gives a truer sense of the way we look at things.
Right. Yeah.
And
Okay.
Peter.
Peter Coghill, Blythe Valley. I mean, the other thing which is long overdue is the need to scrap totally the right to buy legislation. And of course that's been a hot potato as far as any political party is concerned, including Labour, in failing to bite the bullet and address that.
Yeah.
It needs to be done.
Absolutely. Yeah. Fine. So, David, QE and collateral. No, absolutely. The Bank of England has enormous powers, but it cannot create the liquidity. It doesn't actually give. Only banks can apply for QE, for example. So only banks can have an account with the Bank of England.
That money goes into the system, doesn't it?
Well, hang on a minute. So the banks that have the account with the Bank of England are the ones that are in trouble, were in trouble, deep trouble. They needed extra cash. They needed, not even cash, they needed extra liquidity. They had problems. So what they did was they offered the Bank of England an asset as collateral. And sometimes we don't quite know what the value of those assets were. We think sometimes the Bank of England accepted collateral that was probably a bit dodgy. And in exchange for that, the Bank of England gave them, if you like, an overdraft. Right? So think about it as the Bank of England said, look, I'm going to expand your overdraft. I mean, because it isn't actually cash in the sense that we understand it. It's liquidity. It comes in the form of reserves and it stays within the banking system. But fundamental to it all is that the Bank of England has to swap something for that liquidity, and that has to be collateral, and it has to be an asset of some kind. Now, the big tricky thing is how to value that asset. It's, you know, they say, oh, I've got Joe Bloggs' mortgage, and he pays his mortgage every month, so this is a valuable asset, this mortgage. Well, you know, you'd want to check, does Joe Bloggs really pay his mortgage? And is he going to pay it in 10 years' time? So the valuation of the asset is a thing, and I think the Bank of England was often very quick in just valuing the asset and saying, yes, you can have some liquidity in exchange for this. But no credit or money or liquidity can be created without the exchange of collateral and assets, even at the level of QE.
Should we as politicians, though, know what the transfer was? The value?
Well, I would love to know. I think we should as citizens, you know, because the Bank of England is a nationalised bank, and these are our liabilities, basically, ultimately. Because in the end, the Bank of England can only do this because it's backed by taxpayers. So we should know, you know, what's that? But at the height of the crisis, the Bank of England said, I'm going to turn a blind eye, I'm going to give you liquidity, just give me some assets to put onto my balance sheet. So the Bank of England now owns a load of really dodgy assets. I know one of the ECB, for example, has on its balance sheet a loan that was given to some Spanish football player. And he defaulted on that loan, but his bank offered the ECB that loan as collateral, and on the grounds that one day in the future it was going to be repaid, so it had some value, right? But there's always an asset exchange, even at the level of QE. So, Martin, you've got to start with the fact that people can't afford. Now, absolutely, you're right. So you're saying that we should start not from up top here, but from down here, where there are poor people and people with low incomes who cannot afford properties. And that's absolutely right, because simultaneously, with the fact that we globalized the housing market, we globalized, if you like, the financial system, we liberated it in the eyes of the sort of Thatcherite wing of the Tory party. We deregulated and liberalised the financial system, which meant that we allowed them to go beyond. Now, that's happening at that level, and at this level, at the level that you're talking of, incomes have been falling in real terms. And they started falling in the 1980s and 90s, actually. And Labour's share of the national cake began falling then, and is still low. It's extraordinarily low. So when people don't have money, don't have enough income, they can't afford to buy housing either. Now, the housing experts argue that actually there isn't an affordability issue here in Britain, that people can afford, and the supply of housing and affordability. Affordability has not been the key issue for people to get property or to rent, except for the young, for people newly into the market. Now, I'm not arguing that, but I recommend you go and look at the housing experts, because they're arguing that. But I'm with you that it has been absolute obscenity, if you like, that we've had the inflation of property prices and asset prices, while simultaneously we have lowered in real terms incomes. And that's why we have massive inequality now. You know, the poor, the low-income people, on the whole, don't own assets. Those who own assets have watched their assets inflate in value. If you live from wages or salaries, you enjoy an income. And your income in real terms has been falling here in Britain. Wages have been falling since the crisis and are still lower than they were before the crisis. And that makes it hard to get your hands on a property and be able to buy a property. So I think that's the point you're trying to make, is that we should be making sure that people are lifted up. Is that what you're saying?
No, it's not.
Oh, sorry.
It's far more fundamental than that. You mentioned Germany. I understand 80% of people in Germany live in long-term, secure, rented accommodation.
Yes.
My proposal is that it is not possible ever now, in a real political world, to put the majority of people in this country with sufficient income to buy houses. You have to start by saying it cannot happen. If it could, it would be medium or long term. In the short term, housing crisis equals roofs over heads for people, which they can afford, and it's necessary it would be rented, therefore, and it's necessary they should be secure rents.
Right.
And that's where the housing crisis is. The economics is interesting, and long term it may have another solution. But short term and middle term, it's got to be roofs over heads, and you've got to accept that it will have to be rented, and everything should follow. That shouldn't be the end of the presentation. It should start with that. How can we provide rented accommodation? That's where
Right, no, well, I'm absolutely with you there, and I think that was I was trying to say earlier, that the German model is a good model because they do make rental accommodation, but they regulate, they manage, they regulate. And our government is deeply, we are the deregulators of the world. We lead the world in deregulation. And we voted for governments that want deregulation, right? Because that's enabled us to buy our houses and get richer if we own houses, right? So we have if you like, a political consensus that deregulation is a jolly good thing. You know, right to buy for council housing is a jolly good thing. So it's the populations, that mind that has to be changed if we are going to have universally available rented accommodation for everybody. Because, you know, rented accommodation means somebody owns that land, somebody owns that property, and somebody is able to charge whatever rent they want to charge on that property, unless the government intervenes and manages that.
Which is what the Labour Party is for, surely. It's got to be regulated, it's got to be rented, and it's got to be available.
Right. Well, that's fine. I mean, I think...
It has to be financed.
Hang on, okay, Martin, I'm going to move you on.
Yeah.
Right,
so was that... Peter was... Scrap the right to buy. Yes, absolutely. Now, I couldn't agree with that more, and I should have mentioned that. What I didn't do in my introduction was actually to talk about the solutions, and that is one of the solutions, absolutely. The question is, will the Labour Party win an election on that basis? And that is what we have to ask ourselves.
Right, okay, right. Yes?
Judge Morelli, Brian Bannock. You talked about one of your solutions was that we needed to increase sovereign debt in order to get the reduced investment in housing as an asset and credit going into that.
Yes.
I was just wondering what considerations you've given to other ideas advocated by economists like Kate Rayworth, organisations like Positive Money UK, the idea of returning credit controls fully to the state through the issue of like credit vouchers and setting credit limits that can be issued year on year, and just totally revamping the monetary system. Or do you think like ideas like a wealth tax? Currently the majority of wealth taxes that are effective are actually at new people who are seeking to acquire wealth, which hit the youth, like things like the housing equity loan, for example, that will then take like a percentage of the profit that you make on your house. And just these different ideas, how do you see, could they be effective or could they play into what you're talking about as well?
Right.
Did you have your hand up?
Yes, Vicky Jones, Mortgage. Looking at Labour Party manifesto on housing, it seems to be just tinkering around the edges. Do you feel it should needs to be a lot more radical?
I think so.
Yes. I think you had your hand up. It's going to be the last question, I think.
Jeremy from...
Hi, Jeremy.
What three things would you like the Labour Party to put in its manifesto which you'd be certain it could actually implement in a 5-year term about housing and getting rid of this inequality?
So, Jack, I've had long-standing disagreements with positive money, and I don't believe in having a system of credit creation from the top down. For me, the magic of the monetary system is that we, the borrowers, create the money supply. Every time we apply for a loan, we create the money supply. When we're nervous and lack confidence in the economy, we don't, and the money supply contracts. And in a sense, it's a kind of democracy. And while the banks have the power to create credit out of thin air, they can't do it unless we apply to borrow. And so, in a way, it's a kind of democratic system. Positive Money has talked in the past, I think it's changing its views on this, that the Bank of England should decide on the money supply. You need this much money, nation, and you can have this much, and if you don't like it, tough. But we're deciding, and for me that's a very monetarist approach. That's how monetarists think about the money supply too, that it can be managed in that top-down sort of way. So I'm very much opposed to it, while I believe that the creation of credit should be managed, and that credit should not be available for speculative purposes, i.e., give me some, 80% of all bank lending now goes into property, into real estate. So people are borrowing money to gamble on the fact that, their buy-to-let is going to rise forever. The price of it, is going to be an income generator over time. I believe that we have to manage that. In the old days, in the period of Bretton Woods, 1945 to 71, before the introduction of competition and credit control, the Bank of England provided guidance to the banks as to what lending they could do. And they were on the whole told, you can lend for productive activity that generates income. You cannot lend for speculative activity, which may generate income but may also lose income. And so speculation was sort of almost banned by the Bank of England. And then, of course, the banks lobbied and ensured that that was lifted because, investing in property is pretty much effortless activity. Investing in some, wind farm somewhere where you're, taking a risk as to whether or not it'll be successful and generate income and is a long-term investment, that's hard work. And now banks don't do the hard work. They don't invest in productive activity. They're mainly investing in speculation and gambling, essentially.
Sorry, so you're just advocating kind of like a return to like a modern-day Glass-Steagall Act?
Amongst other things, yes.
In coordination with the National Investment Bank to push more into like emerging technologies.
Yes, I'm a Keynesian. Keynes believed in managing the financial system. He understood that the creation of money and credit was very different from any other kind of economic activity. And unlike, the purchase and sale of goods and commodities, credit was something very unique and had to be managed. And so under Keynes, from 1933 onwards to nearly the 1970s, the financial system was managed, and bankers weren't able to do as they pleased. They were then freed up to gamble and speculate, and we've had periodic crises since then. So I disagree with Positive Money about that. I think Kate Raworth has a lot of good ideas, and I'm very much with her. I'm a co-author of the Green New Deal, and I just really do want to see us be investing in green infrastructure. Mainly, I think the difference there is between us is that I believe that employment is fundamental to any green economy, that we would effectively be substituting labour for carbon. But I don't think she agrees with me on that. For me, economic activity is essential to keep society going and stable, and employment in particular is important. And I think we have differences over that. Vicky, is the Labour Party radical enough? No, I don't think so. But you're the Labour Party. I'm not really active in the Labour Party, and I think it's for members like yourselves to be putting terrific pressure on the leadership. I personally, I work with John McDonnell and with other leaders of the Labour Party, and I think they're incredibly conservative. And Labour governments have always been conservative. The most prudent chancellors have been Labour chancellors. Jim Callaghan, effectively gave up Labour's commitment to full employment. I mean, all of them believed in balancing budgets and all of that stuff, So we have a very, very conservative legacy. And when I, attack the Tories, I always argue that actually the Labour Party is far more prudent than any Tory chancellor. And look at Mr. Phil Hammond. We don't hear about austerity anymore, They're going to spend money, these guys. If it means they've got to say Brexit they will spend the money on it. There's no questions asked. You know. If you have to find £1 million for the DUP, boy, you find it overnight. So we don't have any more talk about balancing budgets. But if there were a Labour Chancellor in there, we would, and it was John McDonnell, he'd be really careful about it. The thing that bugs me in particular, and if I might just have this little bugbear quickly, John believes in investing in infrastructure and spending loads of money for that and having an unbalanced budget for infrastructure on the one hand. But on current spending, he believes in balancing the budget. Now, what activities come under the current spending, the current revenue budget? Nurses, teachers, you know, carers, all those people, because they're employees and they work in the social sector. Now that has to be balanced. But if you're a construction worker, a bloke working on some HS2 or some railway line, the government's going to find money for the creation of those jobs. And I argue that actually nurses pay taxes as much as anyone else does. They go shopping and pay taxes. The shopkeeper makes capital gains and they pay taxes. So investing in nurses also pays for itself, and just as much as investing in construction workers. But I haven't been able to persuade John of that. So I want you to...
Social housing, obviously, the income comes back from...
Of course, and social housing, yeah. And so I think to answer Jeremy's point is that the first thing I would demand is the lifting of the caps on the ability of local authorities to borrow. I would say, you know, let's find £20 billion for the local authorities to build social housing. And secondly, when it comes to housing, let's give them powers to take over land, to obtain land at a fair price, determined not by the market, but a much more fairer estimate of prices. And then rent controls. I think those are the three things. And I doubt the Labour manifesto had those demands in it. So there again, there's a task for all of you.
Well, I'm going to stop there because we've also got an AGM. But thank you very much, Anne. It's brilliant because, you know, she's so clear, isn't she? And she's got all these different questions coming from you, just like that. And she explains everything so clearly. So thank you, and come campaigning with us as well, and help us with our campaigning. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.